February 1995. An almond orchard in Stanislaus County, California. 2,400 white wooden boxes sit in long rows along the dirt access roads between the trees. 4 boxes to a pallet, 6 pallets to a truck stack, all painted the same dull cream and stencil-numbered in black on the lid. A 59-year-old woman in a stained Carhartt jacket walks down the second row with a clipboard and a flashlight at 4 in the morning. Her name is Fenella Marsh. The orchard manager is paying her $75 per hive for the 6-week pollination contract. The check at the end of the month will be for $180,000. The largest single contract in the 17-year history of the Marsh apiary. But this story does not start in California. This story starts in October of 1978, on the gravel driveway of a farmhouse 3 miles south of Caldwell, Idaho, when Fenella Marsh sat in the cab of a 1971 Ford F-250 pickup truck for 42 minutes after coming home from her family doctor's office in town, listening to the engine cool and trying to decide whether the doctor had given her advice or a prescription. Dr. Wilbur Hetherington had told her that morning, in the careful voice he had developed over 31 years of practicing medicine in a small Idaho town, that her blood pressure was elevated, that her resting pulse was higher than it should be, that she had lost 12 pounds in the 4 months since her husband had died, and that he could either prescribe her a sedative that would help her sleep, but that she would probably end up depending on, or she could find what he called a daily occupation that required her hands and her attention, but did not require her to think too hard, and which would give her a reason to be outside in the early morning before the household was awake. Fenella was 42. Her husband Calvin Marsh had collapsed in the South alfalfa field on the 2nd of June 1978, in the middle of a routine cutting, and had been dead before the EMT crew from the Caldwell Fire Department had reached the gate. He had been 47. He had not had any prior cardiac history that he had ever mentioned. He had simply finished his life on a Tuesday morning between the 3rd and 4th pass of the Swather, and Fenella had been the one to find him at noon when he had not come in for lunch. They had been married for 19 years. They had 2 children. Their daughter Ingrid was 16, a high school junior. Their son Ezekiel, called Zeke, was 13. The Marsh place was 80 acres along the Boise River, with 50 acres in alfalfa hay, 20 acres in pasture for a small herd of dairy heifers Calvin had been raising on the side, and 10 acres of mixed orchard and garden behind the house. Calvin had been the farmer. Fenella had kept the books and the kitchen and the children. She knew where the irrigation valves were. She did not know how to operate the swather. She did not know the contracts on the alfalfa, where the hay was committed, who owed money on what. She had spent the first 3 weeks after the funeral going through Calvin's desk in the office above the barn, drawer by drawer, and learning what her husband had been doing for 19 years. She found the contracts. She found the equipment loans. She found the operating note at the First National Bank of Caldwell. She found Calvin's hand-drawn diagram of the irrigation system. She also found, in the bottom drawer of the desk, a single typed page from the University of Idaho Cooperative Extension Service, dated 1971, titled Pollination Services for Idaho Fruit Producers, that Calvin had circled in red pen, but that she had never heard him mention. The letter described a small program that connected fruit growers in southwestern Idaho with beekeepers willing to bring colonies onto orchards during bloom. It was a pamphlet. There were no bees on the Marsh place in October of 1978. There never had been. Dr. Hetherington's recommendation, 4 months later, was that Fenella find an outdoor occupation. She did not think about the pamphlet for 2 more weeks. She thought about chickens. She thought about expanding the kitchen garden. She thought about getting a few sheep. None of those ideas felt right. She walked through the barn on a Saturday afternoon in late October, looking at Calvin's tools, and she ended up back at the desk in the upstairs office, and she opened the bottom drawer again, and she pulled out the pamphlet, and she sat at the desk and read it for the first time. The pamphlet listed the names of 3 retired beekeepers in Canyon County who would, the text said, sometimes sell starter colonies to people getting into the business. The list was 7 years old. 2 of the 3 names had Caldwell phone numbers, and the third had a phone number in notice. Fenella was not the kind of woman who made cold phone calls. She had not, in 19 years of marriage, ever called a stranger to ask for anything. She made the calls anyway. The first number was disconnected. The second number rang 12 times and was answered by a woman who said her husband had died in 1976 and that the equipment had been sold to a beekeeper from Marsing, whose name she did not remember. The third number was a man named Orville Twig, who was 78 years old that fall, and who had stopped keeping bees in 1974 because his hips had gotten too bad to lift the hive bodies, and who had a stack of 40 wooden hive boxes sitting in a barn on his property south of Notice, falling apart, that he would let go for $3 each, plus whatever frames he could find inside them, total of $120 for the lot, and that she would have to come pick them up in her own truck because he could not load them. Fenella drove the F-250 to Notice on a Sunday afternoon in early November of 1978. The drive was 43 minutes. Orville Twig met her at the barn with a thermos of coffee and a wool cap pulled down over his ears. The barn was a sagging wooden structure with a sliding door that ran on a single rail, and the inside was full of hay dust and the smell of old wood and the particular smell of beeswax and propolis that Fenella had never encountered before, but that she would learn over the next 17 years to recognize from 100 yards away. The 40 hive boxes were stacked along the back wall. They were in worse condition than Orville had described on the phone. Many of them had wax moth damage. Some had rotted bottom boards. The frames inside were partial and brittle. Fenella stood and looked at them for a long time. Mrs. Marsh, Mr. Twig, I will be honest with you. There is not much here. I see that. The frames are mostly trash. I see that too. The boxes themselves, if you scrape them out and rebuild the bottoms, you can use them. You will need to buy new frames. You will need to buy bees from someone. I will need to learn how. Mr. Twig looked at her. He had not asked any of the questions he should have asked. He asked one of them now. Mrs. Marsh, do you know what you are getting into? No, I do not. He nodded. He drank from his thermos. I will tell you something. The first year you will lose colonies. The second year you will lose more. The third year you will start to learn what you should have known the first year. By the 5th year, you will either have made it or you will not. There is no shortcut. I understand. He looked at her again. He had liked her on sight for reasons he did not need to examine. Mrs. Marsh, I have been thinking. The boxes are $3 each, $120 for the 40. I will throw in the smoker and the hive tool from the wall over there because I cannot use them anymore, and I will give you my old logbook from 1956 to 1974, which has every observation I made in those 18 years. If you read it, and if you read it twice, you will save yourself 2 of the 3 years I just told you about. He did not call himself her mentor. He did not offer to teach her. He gave her the logbook and the smoker and the hive tool and accepted her $120 in cash, and he stood in the barn doorway and watched her load the 40 hive boxes into the back of the F-250 alone, lifting them 2 at a time, while he leaned on his cane and did not offer to help because his hips were too bad, and he knew that she needed to load them herself anyway. He waved as she drove away. She never saw him again. He died in March of 1979. The 40 hive boxes sat in Fenella's barn through the winter of 1978-79. She read Orville Twig's logbook 3 times during that winter, sitting at the kitchen table after the children were asleep. The logbook was 218 pages of pencil notations, dates, weather conditions, hive weights, queen observations, notes on swarm management, notes on disease, notes on mistakes Orville had made and what he had learned from them. It was not a textbook. It was the working notebook of one beekeeper across 18 years of practice, written in shorthand that took her the second reading to begin to understand, and the third reading to begin to use. She bought 4 packages of Italian bees from a supplier in Garden Valley in early April of 1979. Each package was 3 pounds of bees and a caged queen. The total cost was $48. She installed the bees in 4 of the rebuilt hive boxes on a sunny Saturday morning in mid-April, working alone, except for her son Zeke, who was 14 and who held the smoker for her and who got stung 6 times and who did not complain. 2 of the 4 colonies survived to fall. The other 2 absconded within the first week, which Orville's logbook had predicted and explained, and which Fenella now understood to mean that she had failed to prevent the queens from feeling the colony was in an unsuitable location. She wrote her own first entry in her own first logbook on the night the second colony absconded. The entry was 3 sentences. 2 queens left. I do not yet know why. Read Twig pages 1422 again tomorrow. By the autumn of 1979, the 2 surviving colonies had built up their numbers and stored enough honey for the winter. Fenella harvested 28 pounds of honey from the smaller of the 2 colonies, which she sold to a small grocery store in Caldwell for $1.20 a pound. The total income from her first year of beekeeping was $33.60, against expenses of approximately $290. She wrote the numbers in her ledger. She underlined them. She decided to continue. The laughter started in the spring of 1980. Fenella drove into Caldwell on a Wednesday afternoon to buy frame foundation at a feed and farm supply store called Vandermark Implement, which had a small section devoted to beekeeping equipment and which was run by a man named Roger Vandermark, who had been Calvin Marsh's friend since high school. Roger was 52 in 1980. He had attended Calvin's funeral. He had been kind to Fenella in the months after. He was a careful businessman, with conservative views about what types of agricultural enterprise made sense in Canyon County. Fenella walked into the store and asked Roger for 100 sheets of medium frame foundation. Roger asked her what she was building. She told him. She had decided over the winter to expand from 2 colonies to 10, and she was going to need 90 frames built up before the bees arrived from Garden Valley in May. Roger looked at her. He had not known she was keeping bees. He had assumed she was managing the alfalfa and the dairy heifers, and that she would eventually sell the place. The look he gave her was not malicious. It was a look of practical concern from a man who had known her late husband for 30 years, and who believed he was watching a recently widowed mother make a series of impractical decisions out of grief. "Fenella," he said, "can I ask you something?" "Yes, Roger." "Are you sure this is the way you want to spend your time? The bees are not going to make money. There are not enough flowers in this part of Idaho. The commercial guys are all moving south. You would be better off leasing the alfalfa to someone and putting the money in a savings account and focusing on the kids until they are out of school." Fenella was quiet for a moment. She had not expected the conversation. She had expected to buy foundation. She paid for the foundation. She did not respond to Roger's question. She drove home, and she did not return to Vandermark Implement for the next 4 years. She bought her foundation by mail order from a supplier in Mississippi after that. Roger was not the only one. By the summer of 1980, Fenella had 10 colonies in a row along the south fence line of the Marsh place, painted white with stencil numbers, visible from the county road. The neighbors who drove past saw them. The men at the cooperative in Notice heard about them. The women at the Methodist Church in Caldwell heard about them. The story took on a particular tone, which was not cruel, but which contained the same combination of pity and condescension that small communities reserve for widows who try things their late husbands had never tried. Bless her heart. She has not been the same since Calvin. Somebody ought to talk to her about leasing the alfalfa. Those bees are not going to make her any money. She is going to lose the place by 1985. Fenella heard pieces of these conversations from her sister, who lived in Boise and who heard them from a friend in Caldwell. She did not respond to any of them. She kept reading Orville Twig's logbook. She kept working her 10 colonies. She lost 3 of them in the winter of 1980-81 to American foul brood, which she diagnosed correctly only after 2 weeks of consultation with the state apiarist in Boise, a man named Edgar Reisdorf, who made a house call at no charge after Fenella described the symptoms over the phone. She burned the 3 contaminated hives down to ashes in the back pasture, alone, in the rain, on a Sunday afternoon in late October, exactly as Orville's logbook described that she should. Edgar Reisdorf, in 1980, was 61 years old and was the only state-level apiarist Idaho had at the time. He had not expected to find a 44-year-old widow in Canyon County who had taught herself beekeeping from a borrowed logbook. He drove out to the Marsh place a second time in the spring of 1981 on his own initiative to see how the surviving colonies had recovered. He drove out a third time that fall. By 1982, Edgar Reisdorf was visiting Fenella twice a year, every year, on his routine inspection rounds, and was treating her colonies as one of the cleanest and best documented operations in southwestern Idaho. He told her this in 1983. She did not believe him at first. He told her again in 1984, and she began to believe him. Edgar was the second person, after Orville Twig, who saw what Fenella was doing without needing to have it explained. Edgar Reisdorf was important for another reason. In the spring of 1984, on a routine visit, Edgar mentioned to Fenella that the California almond growers were beginning to talk about a problem they had not faced before, which was that wild bee populations in the Central Valley were declining for reasons that were not yet fully understood, and that some of the larger almond growers were starting to bring in commercial bee colonies from out of state to ensure pollination during bloom in February and March. The Idaho beekeepers who were participating in this, Edgar said, were getting paid between $12 and $18 per hive per 6-week contract. Fenella was at 60 colonies by 1984. She wrote down the numbers. She did the math. 60 colonies at $15 each was $900. It was not a fortune. But Edgar mentioned, almost in passing, that the California growers were already talking about needing more colonies than were available, and that the price per hive was likely to rise as the wild bee decline continued. He said this without any particular emphasis. He said it the way a person mentions a weather pattern they have been noticing. Fenella did not act on it in 1984. She made a note of it. She doubled her colony count to 120 in 1985. She doubled it again to 240 in 1986, building out the operation through aggressive splitting of her best genetic colonies and through purchasing additional packages from Garden Valley and Marsing. She built a small extracting room in the barn in 1987 and bought a used 16-frame extractor at an auction in Nampa for $340. She borrowed against the alfalfa ground for the first time in 1988, taking a $14,000 loan from the First National Bank of Caldwell, the same bank where Calvin had borrowed for 19 years, the same bank that had forgiven a $4,200 balance after his death in 1978 because the loan officer at the time had been Calvin's third cousin. The loan officer in 1988 was a different man named Marshall Pendleton, who was 49 years old and who had been hired in from Boise in 1985, and who looked at Fenella's loan application with the expression of a man who was being asked to extend credit against an enterprise he did not understand. Mrs. Marsh, Mr. Pendleton, you want $14,000 to expand your bee operation? Yes. The collateral is the alfalfa ground. Yes. The repayment is from California pollination contracts. Yes. Marshall Pendleton looked at the application for a long time. He had grown up in town. He did not know much about agriculture. He knew, however, that the First National Bank of Caldwell had not extended a loan against a beekeeping operation in its 67-year history. He approved the loan because of two things. The first was that Fenella's books were in better order than any farm books he had seen since taking the job. The second was that Edgar Reisdorf, who Marshall happened to know slightly, had told him, when Marshall called for a routine reference, that the Marsh Apiary was the cleanest operation in the state. Marshall approved the loan and went home and told his wife at supper that he was not entirely sure he had not just made a mistake. He had not made a mistake. By 1990, Fenella had 480 colonies. She made her first California trip in February of 1991, hauling 200 hives down on a flatbed truck she had bought used from a hauler in Twin Falls. She had a contract with a small almond grower in Madera County named Anson Whitfield, who had heard about her through a placement broker named Tibor Carpati, who had a list of out-of-state beekeepers willing to make the trip. The price per hive in 1991 was $22. The total contract for 200 hives across 6 weeks was $4,400. Fenella made the trip alone. She slept in the cab of the truck in the orchard the first night because there was nowhere else to sleep. The next morning, on the second day of bloom, she stood between the rows of almond trees in pre-dawn darkness and watched her colonies wake into the cold morning. She watched the first scout bees emerge from the hive entrances. She watched them lift into the orchard canopy as the temperature climbed past 55 degrees. She watched the orchard begin around her to hum with the sound of 200 colonies finding the bloom in unison. Fenella was 55 years old in February of 1991. She had been a beekeeper for 12 years. She had lost her husband 13 years before. She stood between the almond trees in the cold pre-dawn, and she watched the orchard come alive with her colonies. And she thought about Dr. Wilbur Hetherington telling her in October of 1978 that she needed an occupation that required her hands and her attention, but not too much of her thinking. Dr. Hetherington had been wrong about that. Beekeeping had required all of her thinking. It had also required her hands. It had required her attention. It had required, above all, 12 years of patient continuous learning that had begun with Orville Twig's logbook and that had continued through Edgar Reisdorf's visits and through her own observations made every day in the bee yards from April through October. The orchard hummed around her. The sound was not loud. It was steady. It was the sound of work being done correctly by an animal that had been doing the same work for 100 million years before any human had thought to charge money for it. Fenella drove back to Idaho with $4,400 in her checking account. She paid down the bank loan to $9,200. She had her best honey year on record at home that summer because the colonies, returned from California in early April, were strong and well fed from the almond bloom and ready for the late spring nectar flow in the Boise River Valley. The 1991 trip was the first of 15 consecutive February trips Fenella made to California. The price per hive rose every year. In 1992, it was $26. In 1993, it was $32. In 1994, it was $42. The wild bee decline that Edgar Reisdorf had mentioned in 1984 was now fully understood, and the cause had been identified as the Varroa mite, an external parasite that had spread to American beekeeping in 1987 and that was destroying both wild and managed colonies across the country. By 1994, the wild honeybee population in the United States had collapsed by an estimated 90%. Commercial beekeepers who had survived the Varroa years through aggressive treatment regimens, like Fenella, were the only source of pollination for crops that depended on honeybees. The California almond industry, which by 1994 was producing 600 million pounds of almonds per year on roughly 400,000 acres of bearing trees, required approximately 1 million colonies per bloom season to achieve commercial pollination, and only 1.7 million managed colonies existed in the entire country. The price per hive in California rose accordingly. By February of 1995, The price per hive in the almond bloom contract market had reached $75, a price that would have been unthinkable in 1984 when Edgar Reisdorf had first mentioned the possibility to Fenella in passing. The contract Fenella signed with the orchard manager, Anson Whitfield's son, who had taken over the family operation and expanded it to 1,200 acres, was for 2,400 colonies at $75 each across the 6-week pollination period. The total was $180,000. The Marsh apiary in February of 1995 had 2,640 colonies. Fenella was 59 years old. She had been in the business for 17 years. The check from the Whitfield orchard, which arrived by certified mail on April 11, 1995, was the largest single payment her operation had ever received, and was, in real dollar terms, more than her late husband Calvin had grossed in any year of farming the Marsh place. She did not deposit the check on the day it arrived. She put it in the kitchen drawer where she kept the unopened mail. She drove out that afternoon to the bee yards along the south fence line. The colonies were back from California. The almond bloom had finished on March 22nd, and Fenella had hauled them home over 4 nights in late March. The yards were full again. The sound of the bees was the same sound it had been every spring for 16 years. She walked the rows with her hive tool in her belt and her smoker in her hand. She did not need to inspect the colonies that afternoon. The colonies had been inspected 3 days earlier when she had set them back on their stands. She walked the rows because she walked the rows. It was what she did in the late afternoon when the workday was finishing and the bees were beginning to fan their cool air through the entrances after the warm spring day. She stopped at the 3rd hive of the 2nd row, which was a colony she had identified 6 years earlier as one of her best queens. A colony she had used to produce daughter queens for her splits in 1989, 1990, 1991, and 1992. The original queen was long dead. Her daughters and granddaughters now populated approximately 600 colonies across the Marsh apiary, all carrying the same hygienic genetics that had allowed the operation to weather Varroa with lower losses than the regional average. The bees coming out of the hive entrance in the late spring sun were her bees. They were not exactly her bees. They were, in some sense, Orville Twig's bees, because she had bought them with his hive boxes and his smoker and his logbook. They were Edgar Reisdorf's bees, because Edgar had identified the foul brood in 1980 that would have ended the operation in its 2nd year. They were, in another sense, Calvin Marsh's bees, because Calvin had circled the pamphlet from the University of Idaho Extension Service in red pen in 1971 and had left it in his desk drawer for her to find 7 years later. They were also, simply, bees. Fenella stood at the 3rd hive of the 2nd row and watched the workers depart on their late afternoon foraging trips. She thought, for the first time in many years, about the conversation in Dr. Hetherington's office in October of 1978. The doctor had told her she needed an occupation. He had used that word. She had not been sure at the time whether he had given her advice or a prescription. She had not been sure for many years. She thought she understood now. He had given her something else. He had given her permission, although he had not used the word. He had given a 42-year-old widow with 2 children and an 80-acre place and an unopened operating note and a husband 3 months in the ground permission to do something other than continue. He had given her permission to become a different person than the person she had been on the morning Calvin had not come in for lunch. She had not, in October of 1978, recognized this as permission. She had recognized it as an instruction. She had taken the instruction, and she had executed it the way she executed everything, which was to find an option and make it work. The option had been the pamphlet in Calvin's drawer and the logbook in Orville Twig's barn. The option could have been chickens. It could have been sheep. It could have been a small kitchen garden expanded into a market garden. It would have been any of those things if she had thought about them first, or if she had chanced on them first. The option had turned out to be bees, because the universe, on a particular Sunday afternoon in late October of 1978, had arranged for the names on a 7-year-old pamphlet and the location of an old man in notice and the condition of 40 rotting hive boxes in a sagging barn to converge into the only door that had been open at that particular moment. She walked the row, and she thought about all of this, and she thought about the $180,000 check in the kitchen drawer. The check meant something. It meant the bank loans were paid in full. It meant Ingrid, who was now 33 and married and living in Spokane, did not need to worry about her mother in any practical sense. It meant Zeke, who was now 30 and who had taken over the daily management of the apiary in 1992 after finishing his degree in entomology at the University of Idaho, had a viable inheritance and a profession. It meant the Marsh place would not be sold. It meant the alfalfa ground that had carried Calvin Marsh's family for 40 years would carry their grandchildren. The check meant all of those things. But the check did not mean what people thought it meant. The check did not mean that the bees had been a way of making money. The bees had been a way of staying alive. The bees had been the thing Fenella did at 4 in the morning when she could not sleep, in 1979 and 1980 and 1981. When she had been a 43-year-old and 44-year-old and 45-year-old widow with 2 children and a farm and a grief she did not yet know how to live with. The bees had been the reason to put her boots on at 6 o'clock on a frozen February morning to check on hive insulation. The bees had been the slow, steady work that did not require her to think about Calvin every minute of every day, because the bees required her to think about the bees. The bees, she came to understand around 1985 or 1986, had been a kind of medication that did not have side effects. The money came later. The money came because the wild bees declined, and because the almond industry needed pollinators, and because she had built, without intending to, exactly the kind of operation that the California growers needed during the years when no other kind of operation existed. She had not built it for the money. The money was a consequence of building it. The reason she had built it was that her hands had needed something to do at 5 in the morning in November of 1978, and Dr. Hetherington had told her to find an occupation, and Calvin had left a pamphlet in his drawer, and Orville Twig had been alive in notice, and the universe had pointed her at the bees. She walked back to the house in the long blue light of late spring evening. The check was still in the kitchen drawer. She made a cup of coffee. She sat on the back porch, and she watched the south yard from a distance, where the colonies were settling for the night, the entrance fanning becoming quieter, the last foragers returning, the steady, slow rhythm of 40,000 worker bees per colony shifting into their night cluster as the air cooled. The lesson, she thought, sitting on the porch with her coffee, was not that the bees had made her money. The lesson was that the work had saved her. The work had been the thing. The money had been the consequence of the work. The two things were not the same, and people who confused them, she had come to believe, ended up with neither the work nor the money. She thought about the laughter at Vandermark Implement in 1980. She thought about Roger Vandermark telling her she would be better off leasing the alfalfa. She thought about the conversations at the Methodist Church and at the cooperative in Notice, and all the small condescending kindnesses that small communities offer widows who do not behave the way widows are expected to behave. She did not feel anger about any of it. She had not felt anger about it in many years. She felt something that was closer to a quiet sadness for the people who had laughed, because the people who had laughed had not understood what they were watching. They had thought they were watching a widow making impractical decisions out of grief. They had been watching a person learn to live again by attaching herself to 40,000 creatures per box that did not care about her grief, and that required only that she pay attention to them. The bees had not noticed Fenella's grief. The bees had noticed only whether the queen was laying, whether the colony was queen-right, whether the entrance was clear of ants, whether the brood pattern was solid. The bees had cared about the bees. Fenella had been required, in order to keep them alive, to care about the bees too. And in caring about the bees, she had stopped, slowly, one season at a time, caring quite so much about her own grief. The grief had not gone away. The grief was still there, on the porch with her, on certain spring evenings when the light was a particular kind of blue and the air smelled a particular way. The grief had not disappeared. It had simply been moved by the work from the center of her life to a place along the edge where it was still hers, but where it no longer prevented her from living. That was the lesson. That was the lesson she had learned from the bees, and that she had not been able to articulate to anyone, including herself, for almost 17 years. She finished her coffee. She went inside. She took the check out of the drawer and she looked at it. $180,000, the largest payment of her life. She put the check in an envelope, and she addressed the envelope to the First National Bank of Caldwell. She would mail it on Monday morning. She would deposit it. The money would be the money. The money would pay for some things. But the money was not the lesson. The lesson was already paid. The lesson had been paid every time she had walked out to the bee yards at 5 in the morning in 1980 and 1981 and 1982, when she did not yet know if any of it would work, when the laughter at the feed store was still loud, when she had not yet met Edgar Reisdorf and had not yet known about California, when she was simply a 44-year-old widow in a wool coat carrying a smoker into the cold pre-dawn because Dr. Hetherington had told her to find something to do with her hands. The work itself had been the payment. The work had been the only payment. The check in the envelope was something else, something extra, a gift from the world for having done the work for the right reason, for long enough that the world eventually noticed. Fenella ran the apiary for 14 more years. She turned the daily management over to Zeke in 1999, but continued to walk the yards every morning until 2008, when she was 72. She made her last California trip in February of 2007. She rode in the cab of the truck with Zeke for the entire 11-hour drive each way, and she stood in the orchard at 4 in the morning on the first day of bloom with her hands in her jacket pockets, and she watched the sun rise over the almond trees, and she did not say anything to Zeke for a long time. He did not ask her to. He understood what she was doing. The Marsh apiary continued to operate. By 2024, when Fenella was 88 and living in a small apartment Zeke had built onto the side of the farmhouse, the operation had 6,800 colonies and was supplying pollination services to 7 major almond operations and 3 blueberry operations in Oregon. The annual gross had passed $2.4 million. The Marsh place was worth, on paper, somewhere over $4 million, none of which was the point. The point was the work. The point was that on a Sunday afternoon in late October of 1978, a 42-year-old widow had driven a 1971 Ford F-250 to a sagging barn in Notus, Idaho, and had paid an old man named Orville Twig $120 in cash for 40 rotting hive boxes that nobody else wanted. And that act, more than any other act, had been the act of saying yes to something she could not yet name. She had said yes to the work. The bees had been the form the work had taken. But the work was the lesson. The work was always the lesson. The work was the only lesson. And the people who had laughed at the rotting hive boxes had not understood what they were laughing at, because they had thought they were laughing at boxes, and they had actually been laughing at a 42-year-old woman finding her way back to her own life by way of the only doorway that had been open. The boxes were not the point. The work was the point. The work was always the point. That is what Fenella Marsh had learned in 17 years of beekeeping, and what she would have told anyone who asked, if anyone had ever asked, although nobody ever did, because the people who needed to know the lesson were not the kind of people who asked questions. And the people who asked questions were not, usually, the people who needed the lesson. The lesson was earned. The lesson was always earned. The lesson could not be given. It could only be paid for in cold pre-dawn mornings and in losses that would have taught a different person to quit, and in the slow accumulation of small correct decisions made every day for years, until somewhere in the middle of it, the person you had been when you started had become someone else. Someone who knew things she had not known. Someone who could carry what she had not been able to carry. Someone who could stand in an almond orchard in California at 4 a.m, 17 years after the worst day of her life, and watch 2,400 colonies begin to wake into the bloom and feel, for a moment, that the world had answered her after all.